So biologically, we can look at this at a number of different ways, but we can start from our teeth. Our teeth have changed dramatically in the last sort of 8 million years, becoming smaller and smaller because we're chewing softer and softer foods. We're not chewing on sticks all day like a gorilla does, and so we're getting carnivorous adaptations to our teeth and our brains. Our brains are growing bigger because we can support a bigger brain. And we also need a bigger brain to figure out how to get animal source protein and nutrition. And that's very simple because we cannot take down a mastodon with our bare hands. We're not going to take down an elk with our bare hands. And we're not going to be able to rip it up and eat it as well. And that's why we had to develop tools and tactics. And that's why our brains grew instead of our claws and our teeth. And so that's why we live in houses and lions don't. That's why we developed our intelligence, and chimpanzees and gorillas didn't. So to the extent that we have anyway, because they actually are pretty smart animals. But then just looking at the GI tract, you go down to our stomach pH is very, very low. It's around 1.4, 1.5. And other carnivores are around like 2, like lions are usually around 2. You look at buzzards and vultures and carrion animals, they're around the 1.4, 1.5 range. And that's because they have the food that they're eating has a high bacterial load. And so they need to be able to kill off that bacteria so they don't get sick. We, in our evolutionary past, seem to have come from a scavenger background where we were just eating off the remains of the kills that, another more physically adapted animal would have made a kill and then left some leavings. And this is actually where the original stone tools came from, using big, large pound stones to crack open the skulls of these animals and get at the brains, because this was very nutritious, very high calorie and fat content that was very, very good for our early ancestors, and any animal for that matter. But that's what we had to adapt. We had to adapt that high stomach pH. It's simply because we had to eat meat that had a lot of bacterial load. This even more recently, without refrigeration, people would be eating meat. They'd try to store and dry meat, but things would go off, things would go bad, and you'd have to be able to contend with that high bacterial load. Then you look at the fact that we have 5 organs working in concert just to absorb fat. So our stomach starts breaking down food in the process of digestion. Then our liver makes bile. Our gallbladder stores that bile. Our pancreas makes things like lipase and other enzymes that break down the food and break down the fat into digestible, absorbable products. And then that bile emulsifies the fatty acids, and your small intestine absorbs it. Okay, so you have 5 organs working in concert just to absorb fat. If fat weren't really, really important, it would not do this. It wouldn't have wasted its time and energy. This is a very high energy demand to keep these organs functioning in that process of absorbing fat. So if that wasn't extremely important, we would not be spending all this energy and coordination in order to absorb it. The other fact is that we cannot break down fiber. All herbivores that eat high fiber diets, they get actually most of their nutrition from the breakdown of that fiber. The bacteria in their guts actually feed on the fiber. There are no vertebrate animals that can break down fiber. So they have to cultivate these bacteria, which break down the fiber and actually eat the fiber. And that's what they get their nutrition from. And then they expel and excrete short chain fatty acids. That's a waste product of these bacteria. And that's what the animal absorbs. And these are 100% saturated fats. So even gorillas that just eat green leaves, they get about 70% of their calories from saturated fat. Cows get as much as 80% of their calories from saturated fat because they're much more efficient at breaking these things down. And then those bacteria break down and die off, and the animal absorbs those and gets the protein from those bacteria. And so that's actually what they are eating. We don't have that ability anymore. We've lost that millions of years ago. And this is evidenced by the fact that we have what's called an appendix, which in other primates and other animals who are hind gut digesters is actually a very, very long cecum. And that's where fiber will actually pack down into and break down into short chain fatty acids. So that's where they get the majority of their of their nutrition and their calories. We don't have that ability anymore. An appendix is a vestigial cecum. Vestigial meaning that millions of years ago, it used to be this large organ that could do this, but since we haven't used it in millions upon millions upon millions of years, it has shriveled up and gone away because your gut has a very high energy demand. And so if you're not using part of your intestine, it is really holding you back and wasting energy, which is death in the wild. So you can also look at this in as far as colon disease and diverticulosis. Diverticulosis has been shown to have only a few correlating events. So constipation, high-fat diet, and meat diets and all these sorts of things have no association with diverticulosis. In fact, there's a study showing with thousands of patients and thousands of colonoscopies looking at what factors were associated with this. They found the only things that had even an association with diverticulosis, which is sort of the outpouching and breakdown of your distal colon. And it's going to get infected and have problems. You can die from this. You have to get part of your colon removed. You'll have to have a colostomy bag. And the only things that were associated with diverticulosis, which could then turn to diverticulitis, was increased fiber and increased number of bowel motions a day. All right. So the more fiber people ate, the more people defecated, the more likely they were to have colon disease and the breakdown and failure of their colon, because that's how I think about it. I think of this as organ failures, such as heart failure. Your heart is beating against a very high pressure gradient for years and decades on end, and eventually it just goes, that's it, I give up. And it starts to break apart and break down, and that's heart failure. Well, I look at diverticulosis as colon failure. You have overworked this organ, and it's just run out of life. It's just run out of miles, and it's just going to start falling apart now and not work as well as it would have otherwise. Even when people do get diverticulitis or appendicitis or cancer and anastomoses and other sorts of bowel issues, you will see general surgeons and colorectal surgeons putting people on what is called a low residue diet. Really, that's just a low fiber diet. And that's because they want to rest the bowel. And so they don't want the bowel working and expending all this effort and energy and pushing and squeezing and peristalsing to get rid of this stuff, right? Because they want the bowel to just heal and rest. So you don't want to overwork it. Okay, but everyone's saying that fiber is good for you, that peristalsis and moving and motion, all that stuff is really good for the bowel, and this is beneficial for you. So why, if that's true, then why do we, whenever there's a problem, rest the bowel and avoid fiber? And that helps the bowel. If fiber is going to help the bowel and it's good for the bowel, then it should be good in those circumstances as well. Okay, so that never really made sense to me, because you're causing harm in a harmed state. Why is that not causing a harm or overworking and overusing that organ in a non-pathological state? That never really made sense to me. So these people will say, don't eat fiber, but then when this is done, oh, you better eat fiber because that's what's going to protect you. That makes absolutely no sense. And the only reason people are saying this is just because they've been trained to say this their entire life, and they haven't actually thought about it. Okay. And also think about this. This is waste material. This is going out. It's being excreted. That means your body can't use it. That means your body didn't want it and it wants to get it out. Okay. If fiber was so good for us, why is our body just pushing it out at all costs? It actually isn't good for us. It actually causes harm to us. It causes microabrasions in the gut lining, causes increased mucus secretion and inflammatory responses as well. It also blocks the absorption of nutrients in our small intestine and makes it impossible for our body to absorb everything that we're eating. How is that beneficial? How is that evolutionarily selected? Why is it that if you're eating something and you're blocking your body from absorbing the nutrients, that this provides an advantage somehow? That doesn't make any sense either. So you have to think about these things on first principles. And when you start looking at like that in this direction, these things start becoming a little more obvious. Then you have IBD and IBD and irritable bowel disease, such as Crohn's and ulcerative colitis. There are studies actually going back to the 1800s showing that if you put people on a pure red meat and water diet, that you actually reverse these and stop these processes from happening. Dr. J.H. Salisbury of the Salisbury steak has actually shown this, wrote a whole book about it. And even as recently as 1975, Dr. Vogelin, who's a gastroenterologist, also reiterated this and wrote a book called The Stone Age Diet, arguing that humans, yes, are carnivores. And if you eat as a carnivore, you will stop having gastrointestinal diseases such as Crohn's and ulcerative colitis. More recently, because this has all been papered over, because everyone said that fat and cholesterol were bad. And so 100 years of medical literature and knowledge just gets thrown out the window and just completely ignored after that. But even more recently, there have been studies looking at elemental diets with IBD, Crohn's and ulcerative colitis, and an elemental diet, meaning that they just take the specific macro and micronutrients that you need without any of the extra stuff that sometimes comes along with this. And they found that this was better for getting people out of an acute exacerbation, a flare-up of Crohn's and ulcerative colitis than steroids were, like prednisolone or prednisone. And they also looked at fasting mimicking diet. And fasting mimicking diet is just a ketogenic diet. So you're just eliminating carbohydrates and getting your metabolism into the so-called fasting state, which, as anyone who's listened to me before knows that I completely disagree with. I think that is our primary metabolic state. And this would be another piece of evidence to suggest that, because on a fasting mimicking diet versus a carbohydrate with fiber diet, they found that people with Crohn's and ulcerative colitis stayed in remission on average 51 weeks, whereas on the carbohydrate and fiber diet, they stayed in remission on average 0 weeks. All right, that's not a lot of weeks. So this is already in the literature now. So you don't even need all the stuff going back 100 years, 120 years, 150 years, but it is there.